Welcome to Literaturforum im Brecht-Haus, to our fourth evening of our week called Nach der Ruhe vor dem Sturm über Katastrophismus, Kapitalozän und Kollapsologie, amateurishly translated by myself to After the Calm, Before the Storm, about catastrophism, Kapitalozän and collapse. I am very happy to announce that our guests tonight speak better English than I do. And here is Jason Moore, theoretically on the screen, live from New York. Yes, here he is. And Raul, Zelik, and Rübner, Hansen on stage here with us. Ines Schwerdtner, a politic analyst and author, and also chief editor from the German edition of the Jacobin magazine, will lead us through this evening. Yeah, that's it from me for now. Ines takes it from here. My name is Isabel Wanger, and have fun.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. Ooh, that's pretty loud. Is it okay? It's okay to... Jason, can you hear me? Okay, cool. I have to look into this camera so that it seems like I look at you, whereas you are here. It's a bit strange, but okay. So welcome, and thank you for coming to this discussion. I'm very much looking forward to it. We're going to talk about the Kapitalozän and why we rather talk about this than the Anthropocene, which is the term that probably most of you know, and that I guess is more like in the mainstream kind of discussion about this. We see all the catastrophes happening around us, and yet we don't have a solution or like a political strategy to fight that. And so we're going to talk about this on a theoretical level, and I'm very happy to have three guests who are able to do both, talk about it in a very theoretical manner, but also to be able to talk about the political strategy to actually approach the kind of catastrophes and the collapse of climate that we're facing right now. So I'm very happy to have you all here, and I'm going to begin with you, Jason, who's on the screen with us here. We're very happy that you could make it. It's like noon at your place in the state of New York, right? So I think you already know Jason Moore. You might have heard of him. He's an environmental historian, professor of sociology at the Binghamton University in the state of New York, as I said, and he wrote this book that just came out in German. It's called Kapitalismus im Lebensnetz. It's Capitalism in the Web of Life. I think it was published 2 years earlier in English, and you have spread lots of discussion was spread around this book. In the German context, it's not that debated as widely, which I think is a pity, because it's actually, to me, one of the most like enhancing Marxist approaches that I have read in the last years, because he's combining a critique of capital and about a class conflict, but also he's combining it with critique of imperialism and racism, and he's also taking into consideration unpaid labor and like feminist political ecology and also economy. So I think this is like a really wide range that only a few Marxists or scholars actually take upon. And as I think, and you might want to correct me later, I think this is a new approach in a sense that it's not new, and you're saying it's not a theory, but it opens up a space for discussion. And I think that we should take the chance tonight to use your kind of space that you're creating with this web of life and this world ecology approach in order to talk about political strategy. So thank you, Jason, for being here with us tonight. And for you, it's noon, but still, thank you. And also we have Raul Zelik with us. He's on the left. Welcome, Raul. He also has a really great book that I'm happy to show you. It's called Wir Untoten des Kapitals, über politische Monster und einen grünen Sozialismus. It came out last year at Surkamp, and we had the book launch more than 1 year ago. It was on the streets of Kreuzberg. It was really cool. was the last event that we had before Corona, I think, or like in the beginning. So I'm glad that we are now talking about it again. And yeah, you will have to explain to us what green socialism means then. Could that be one solution to the problem? And in case you don't know, Raul's work, he's also like an author of many novels and other works, translating books. So yeah, look up what he's written. This one is a great book, but the others are too. And then we have Bo Rübner Hansen, Boe, right? It's called in Danish, okay. He's a researcher at the University of Jena, which you might know, the Institute for Sociology. It's one of the few places in Germany where you can still have like critical research in the way that Boe does. So yeah, he's a postdoc in intellectual history at the Institute of Sociology, and he's also an editor of Viewpoint magazine, and you can look up his essays and articles at Viewpoint, and also, like, I guess in other magazines, but this is your main reference. So yeah, I'm happy to have you all, and the evening will like be as follows, or as I have imagined it, that Jason will give a short keynote, because as you can see, his book is really large, and there's a lot to understand about the Kapitalozän and politics. And after his short keynote, the other two will be able to ask questions and comment on that, and then we have some questions between us, and then I would like you to also ask questions if you want to, like, don't feel pressure to do so, but I think debate is always a good thing, so we could use the end of this discussion also for you to ask questions, because I think this is an extraordinary panel, and I guess lots of questions will come up. But yeah, so for now, Jason, the floor, I give you the floor, and please start with your short keynote on the Kapitalozän. What does it mean?
Wonderful. All right, I will keep this to about 10 minutes. And I'll begin just by thanking everyone for this wonderful opportunity with all three of you to enter into a conversation. That indeed, I think, has been one of the great limitations of historical materialism over the 20th century, that Marxists want to go to war against each other instead of looking creatively, dynamically, and in solidarity at the intellectual and therefore political problems before us and the possibilities for a generative reinvention of a revolutionary socialist project. And if we are ever in the midst of a crisis that calls for a revolutionary project, it is in the midst of the planetary inferno. I used to use those words as metaphor. It's clear it's no longer a metaphor. We are in the midst of the storm, not in the calm of it. And so let me begin just by recognizing the temptation, the seduction of bourgeois naturalism with a long history that goes back to Thomas Malthus, but even earlier into the 16th century, into the birth of the civilizing project, into the dawn of the great genocidal, ecocidal, and profit-making endeavors of Columbus and the great European empires. This is the invention of not just the idea, but the political practice of humans versus nature, of man versus nature. And to quote the great Claudia von Verhoeven, nature is everything the bourgeoisie does not want to pay for, which includes, as you heard in the very, very kind introduction, includes the unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature. And so from that standpoint, I want to resist the temptation to succumb to the major categories of bourgeois naturalism, again, man versus nature, which include this absolutely disastrous and pathologically dangerous term, age of man, Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene, as we know, is a geological construct that the scientists, as ever, have in their great arrogance said, well, we can figure out historical change, we can figure out human affairs, and in the process completely ignore all the dynamics of conflict, of class, of states, of empires, of everything else in the making of class society, not only the class society of capitalism, but the class societies from the middle of the Holocene, that is between 6,000 and 8,000 years before the dawn of class society, which in fact creates the conditions for this long geological era, the Holocene, meaning recent era, the Holocene, which is an era of unusual climate stability. As Rübner and many others have demonstrated, it was the dawn of agriculture and, in my interpretation, the dawn of class society that acted as an Archimedean lever to stabilize the relatively warm and stable climate of the Holocene, which in contrast to the previous interglacial periods did not, as we know, revert into another major ice age, into a major glaciation. That's really significant because the Holocene that began 11,700 years ago, that was then sustained by the dawn of class society today, dawn of class society 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, rather, is coming unraveled today. And so it's very important that we take seriously the geological contributions, and that as historical materialists, we refuse the arrogance of the climate scientists in refusing to take seriously the core problems of historical materialism, which, by the way, from the beginning were about climate and webs of life. When Marx and Engels introduce their classic statement of historical materialism in the German ideology, arguing against the young Hegelians, arguing against a mode of thought, which, by the way, has become dominant, a mode of debate which has become dominant among eco-socialists, that we're going to throw phrases against other phrases. No, we're going to look at the actual history of class society. And they begin, Marx and Engels begin by saying that we need to look not only at the geographical and climatological conditions, but to look at those and their history of subsequent modification. And that's a direct quote. They probably say it better in the original German, but we were going to look at not just the natural conditions, so-called, but their constitutive transformations of environments through the making of class society. So in other words, the Kapitalozän takes seriously the historical materialist premise that class society operates with and within webs of life. That is not man versus nature in the sense of billiard balls colliding into each other. No, it is, in the tradition of revolutionary dialectics, a mutually formative dynamic of historical change. And so what the Kapitalozän does, and I'll just lay this out in a few minutes, is first and foremost, it is an argument about the origins of planetary crisis, when and where. Our position is 1492. There is a historical debate as to whether one wants to begin in 1492 or 1830. Let me say that yes, indeed, the advent of large-scale industry represents a crucial amplification of the relations of power, profit, and life that were first established in 1492. Most fundamentally, we are looking at the dynamics of capital accumulation and class struggle in its many faces since 1492 in establishing the conditions for large-scale industrialization in the 19th century. So this view takes an anti-imperialist critique seriously, and it refuses the Eurocentric critique of class formalism. That is the very kind of narrow class formalism that led European social democratic parties into war in 1914, that led famously the French Communist Party into failing to support the national liberation struggles of Algeria. Our approach takes seriously the anti-imperialist class struggle critique of Luxemburg, Fanon, Wallerstein, Maria Mies, and many others. So this is a way of thinking through capitalism in the web of life. And that means to take seriously not only power, profit, and life as dynamic processes of environment making, of class struggle, of power creation, but it also points towards the tyranny of the ruling ideas, again, from Marx and Engels, what I call ruling abstractions of man versus nature. And it points out that taking the constructs of humanity and society on the one hand and nature on the other are not only interpretively misleading, they are also practical guidelines for the exercise of power. And what was it that European empires discovered upon landing on the new shores of a new land? What is it they discovered? They discovered that the inhabitants there were uncivilized, unchristian, undeveloped. They were irrational. They were savage. And it is here that we find the genesis of capitalism, not only as an economic system, but as a system of power and domination that relies on super exploitation. Above all, the creation of modern sexism and modern racism in a crucial moment of capitalist history. It occurs between the years 1550 and 1700. That is the moment of capitalism's first climate crisis. That is a climate crisis partly due to natural forcing, which we can talk about, and partly due to what Maslin and Lewis, the great geographers, call the Orbis spike, the global spike, the reduction in carbon dioxide concentrations as a result of the New World ecocides and genocides. If you have learned a familiar story of the invasion of the Americas, it was a biological accident, that 95% of the population died, let me disabuse you of that narrative. While some share of Native American populations would have died, the driving force behind this dynamic was a search for cheap labor. This is now very well established in the historiography decades after the great environmental historian Crosby. Now, to conclude, why this speaks to the issues of revolutionary strategy today. And I want to just highlight, I think, two major sets of issues. One is that it is in this era of the long, cold 17th century that I just mentioned, in connection with the Orbis spike and the most intense period of the Little Ice Age, that we see the plantation revolution, the financial revolution, the maturing of the capitalist military revolution, all of which signaled a profound dynamic of what I'm going to call planetary proletarianization. And it involved at least three major moments dialectically connected. One, of course, is proletarianization properly conceived. That is the expansion of the wage labor relation across the European heartland. And I've written about this, that proletarianization goes much faster than population growth. The other part, which is intimately connected to this, is the creation of a modern femitariat. That is the creation of systems of power and control to install a man-woman, man-nature dynamic that creates women, in Silvia Federici's turn of phrase, as the savages of Europe. And why? Because nature, this is Claudio von Verhoeven, nature is everything the bourgeoisie does not want to pay for. The bourgeoisie does not want to have to pay for cheap care, for all manner of social and socio-biological procedures of social reproduction. It wants cheap labor above all. So we're seeing right now that we're crossing the paid work and unpaid work divide that are dialectically and historically interpenetrated. And finally, in an overlapping category, is the creation of nature with the uppercase N. This is the creation of what I will call the biotariat, after the poet Stephen Collis. The biotariat is all of those forms of nature, human and otherwise, mobilized in service to a good business environment, mobilized and dominated in order to advance the rate of profit. So here is the biotariat, but it also is related, its cognate ideological form is Prometheanism. And of course, no civilization has been more Promethean in its aspirations than capitalism. So one dynamic of solidarity and struggle is precisely asking, how do we put together politically an alliance of proletariat, femitariat, and biotariat, which are not separate categories, but heuristics. They are different dimensions, overlapping and mutually constitutive dimensions of the planetary proletariat. And this carries us into a recognition that the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid are not the results of the geophysical crisis of the overaccumulation, if you will, of greenhouse gases. They are the causes, they are the drivers of today's planetary crisis, which knits together a crisis of the biosphere, a turning point in the biosphere, a crisis of accumulation, and a crisis of political rule. We can tease that out. Finally, on the question of direct political implications, I'm increasingly concerned that in these discussions around green socialism, and Raul, forgive me, I haven't read your book, but I look forward to using my impoverished German language skills to do so, is an unwillingness to look at two of the greatest problematic elements of 20th century history. And let me try to say these in 2 sentences, and we can go beyond in the discussion. One is the history of we had to destroy the village in order to save it. This is the classic statement of imperialism and the civilizing project when confronting projects of national independence. Never mind communism, although that much of that was in the history of the 20th century. So we need to look at the willingness of the imperialist forces, not only to allow the climate crisis to unfold, but to mete out the most devastating and destructive response to any attempts to oppose the imperial system. And that's one part of it. The other part of it, specifically in relation to the Green New Deal and other green social democratic politics, is we have to look at the last great high point of left-wing social democracy in the mid-1970s. This was also the Euro-communist movement. And what was it the social democratic projects faced in this moment? Military and intelligence-like coups. You can think of the Wilson government, Labour government, overthrown by the connivance of British intelligence in the mid-1970s. That's not a conspiracy. Go read up on it. Of course, the disciplining of the Palma social democratic government in the early 70s, Allende's refusal to mobilize an all-out civil war in the context of Pinochet's struggle. The Whitlam government in Australia, the left-wing Labour government there, was overthrown with the connivance of the Queen of England. Yes, indeed, the Queen of England. And so we need to look seriously at the unwillingness of social democratic politics to mobilize the kind of popular movements that would be necessary to sustain even mild social democratic reforms. And let's be clear, that's not what is needed today. Mild social democratic reforms is not going to do it. It is not appreciably going to buy us more time. So we need to come up with strategies of solidarity within the different elements of the planetary proletariat, both north-south, but also across biotariat, femitariat, and proletariat. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I think that was a lot to digest for the moment. Thank you, indeed. And I guess Raul and Boo have something to react to that. I mean, I want to know from you actually now what when you like encountered Jason's approach, like what did that make to your thinking? Did that change something into your thinking? And what do you make of his suggestion with the proletariat, the femitariat, and the biotariat? Boo.
I suppose I can go first, so that's okay. I think one thing that is a really important strength of Jason's work is not only his critique of what he calls bourgeois naturalism and the distinction between society or humanity and nature, but the proposal for a different way of conceiving this, which is society and capitalism, etc., in the web of life. And I think this is a crucial adaptation of a concept from ecology. An ecologist called Fritjof Capra is one who's developed this concept that has been proposed long before him. But the basic idea is that we have to change our perception of the ways in which we reproduce ourselves from social reproduction going on over here and nature going on over there, and then you have a kind of relation of externality to understanding that we are embedded in the web of life, and we can be so either in a way that is careless and destructive, which of course has to do with specific economic systems, capitalism, or we can be embedded in a way that's careful. So it opens to a feminist rethinking of what transition means. It opens to a feminist understanding of how we can not only fight fossil capitalism, which is of course urgent and necessary, but also how we can repair our relationship to other species and ecosystems within which we find ourselves currently existing in a highly destructive way. So this is something that I've learned from Jason, and I think this is a crucial thing to hold in mind, that we need to connect the critique of capitalism with concepts that allow us to imagine another way of being in the world.
Yeah, for me the book was so interesting because, well, I think those who we are in political parties or organizations, we all know these discussions about social issues and ecological issues as opposed. And I think it's not so new, the idea that that there has to be a dialectic relationship between both areas. And indeed, you find these ideas already in Marx's writings. There's a very interesting book from Kohai Saito about rereading of Marx excerpts, which I really find very instructive too. And you have this eco-socialist discussions from all this group of John Bellamy Foster. I know that you have we had some struggles, and I don't want to get into these struggles. But I think this is a really enriching literature which came up from the works of John Bellamy Foster. And I studied with Elmar Adfaser, and I know that there was an interesting eco-socialist debate in the 70s, 80s, I would say 80s more, in Germany. So I think what I really found interesting that Jason is trying to bring this debate further. Yeah, that it's not only this book. There are some studies, investigations about dialectic of how do you call this? Netherlandish, Dutch, yeah, about Dutch hegemony in the Baltic countries, which I find is a really interesting case study to explain how you can explain world relationships, social transformation and ecological transformation as interconnected. Yeah, so I think you can really learn these things, and I was not so convinced by this intent of building a mega theory. So I'm not so convinced of the notion, for example, of how do you call it, bioarchy, yeah, all these. Or the other case in the book is, for example, how Jason tries to use value theory for ecological issues. So I think that if you use a Marxist concept of value theory, then nature is not producing value. And if you want to discuss the point that nature also is creating wealth, then you have to go outside of value theory and Marxist value theory at least. So I'm not so convinced, but I really found it very instructive to read these ideas. So I'm totally agree with Jason, what he said at the beginning. It's not now the point to get into a discussion and to say that's wrong. I find it very instructive to read it, and I was not totally convinced. And we had a discussion here, we had the ecological, eco-socialist summer school, and we read in 2 sessions, we read some parts of Jason Moore's books. It was really interesting. And one of the scholars or one of the participants said, for me, it's no contradiction. You can think both concepts, the one of Jason and of the critiques of Jason, and both are instructive to understand the problem. And I would say this is a good approach to the problem. So I would say it is really instructive. It's really necessary to understand these dialectics between ecological and social process. And so this is very important work what Jason does. And we don't have to agree with all theories and ideas to say it's a great book.
And to come back to the differentiation between what you said, man and nature, and also like society and nature, because I know that I happen to make the same mistake in text, and like always when I also talk about like the exploitation of working people and also the exploitation of nature. And I mean, I think what you suggest really opened my eyes in some ways, saying that this is a dynamic and there's like exploitation of like different, not just human nature, but like also, what do you call it, like trans nature or like transhuman nature? So like this really changed something for me, but it's still hard to then intervene in what I would call like, the mainstream debate, because we talk about, as you said, we talk about like emissions and innovations and technology and how to like sort of, we talk about tipping points that are like, can we actually reach this kind of goal 1.5 degree? And also we talk about man-made climate change. So everything, all the terms that we use in everyday language are actually completely different from what you suggest. And I'm really thinking about what do you make of that? Like how could you change this way of thinking also in like the climate movement and like socialist parties that we're engaged in? Like I think many of us here are activists, thinking about how can we change this way of thinking in political terms. Like, do you have any suggestions?
Well, emancipatory movements, starting with working class and anti-colonial movements, even in the 17th and 18th centuries, always insisted on a social vocabulary of naming the system and articulating the relations of power and production, of justice and injustice. So it's very curious to see some eco-socialists saying, oh, this is just wordplay. The hell it is. First of all, we're dealing with a critique of ideology. But the second thing is that this is a dynamic that all emancipatory movements go through, that they insist on a vocabulary, an anti-systemic vocabulary of justice. This is true for working class movements, national liberation movements, feminist, gay, lesbian, queer, all manner of sexuality movements, feminist movements, go down the list. All insist that the ideological structures of bourgeois hegemony have colonized our minds and our vocabulary. And it is true that the words that we use to identify a problem are not only cognitively significant, but also politically significant. And so as activists will surely know, the separation of environmentalist from labor vocabularies of struggle, of race, anti-racist and class movements, vocabularies of struggle, the fragmenting of those discourses has stymied our imagination. So I think we need to confront we need to confront directly man versus nature as not only problematic signifiers of words floating out there in the ether, but as crucial levers of bourgeois domination from the origins of capitalism, not least because not just the languages, but the actual practices of profit-seeking sexism and racism in their modern form are infused with naturalistic metaphors. And so we want to, I think, begin to unthink the dynamics of bourgeois ideology that were really installed in the most recent phase of bourgeois naturalism since the first Earth Day in 1970, which was a protest about problems, but in an era where there was no crisis. It was a fantastic wedge issue, if you will, to contain an insurgent new left and anti-colonial and workers' struggles across the world. So that's what I would just remind people of, that these vocabularies are not innocent. And if there is to be a working class environmentalism, then we need to look at the ways that language and connection, what are we connecting, what are we prioritizing, are there. We need to move away from saving nature. We need to move towards a working class environmentalism that understands that what brings the working class and the rest of nature together is the Promethean drive to extract more and more paid and unpaid work. And just on that notice, well, I think we agree. I argued against nature producing value. I don't think that nature produces value, which would be a bourgeois naturalist conceit. And so it actually connects with this point here, that we are looking at a historical specification of what Marx says in the critique of the Gotha program, that we need to refuse to give supernatural powers either to labor or to nature, that we need to understand that this is a dialectic.
Yeah.
So that's a start.
Cool. Just with regards to the last point first, I think the question of nature and value relates to the fact of human species reproduction as something that is natural, historical, which means that it is a historical transformable and constantly transforming way of being as nature, reproducing ourselves. It can be done in many different ways, as we know. What has historically been understood as women's labor is not productive when it's unwaged, is not productive in a technical sense of value, but it's productive of the conditions of value production. And what happens in terms of the labor of nature, if we can, and this is using it metaphorically, but the activity of different species, plants growing, etc., is not productive of value, it's productive of wealth, which is a condition of value production for capital, right? So capital needs all this to go on, which means that just because women and in this kind of historically specific category, women's labor is not productive of value, doesn't mean that it is not essential and its withdrawal will have systemic implications. The same happens when you have the collapse of the fertility of the land, for instance. That means a collapse of the value production of the agricultural capitalist, of course. So that's the kind of value theory side. It's a little bit technical. In terms of your question about how we change the language, obviously, language and practice hang together, right? So let's say enslaved people, they were considered not human or not fully human. And of course, they would make, together with abolitionists, the claim that they are human. And making the claim could only take them so far. Enacting their humanity in various different ways, one of them rising up against the slave owners and overthrowing them, as in the case of Haiti, was a way to assert their humanity and force others to recognize them as such. So we have to connect these things, and we have to look at what are the ways in practice that we can relate to other species in a way that doesn't reproduce the distinction, the dichotomy between humanity and nature, but also what are the ways that we already are doing this, right? So just to take a very banal example, let's say that there is a meadow, or a beautiful natural area, we want to maintain it. So is it about protecting nature, or is it about protecting the life that we have passing through, which is, and the enjoyment and joy that we have, which is dependent on the joy of and the life of the different species that are there, right? So our well-being is in a very immediate, and in this case banal way, interconnected with the well-being of the different species that make up the meadow, right? And this is the same obviously on a planetary scale. When we talk about the biosphere, we're not disconnected from the biosphere, and we know that, right? And we know that when we engage in all sorts of activities, we know that it's messy. Do we call having sex, is that natural or is it social? Well, it's kind of both. It's natural, historical, and and we can do it in many different ways. So I think we have to get to those experiences where we're already readily able to accept that there is no strong distinction to be made between humanity and nature.
Okay, so I have one last theoretical question before we come to the political strategy. Before we go deeper into that, I think Jason already hinted at that, and you also said it in an interview for Jacobin. You said we're experiencing like a revolutionary situation. That's like the term that we like to use in the German, a revolutionäre Situation. Do we experience that right now, or is it rather what could also be, and what I fear actually, is that the capitalist system will be able to transform, and we will then have like a weird green capitalist transformation, sort of like we won't be we won't survive that in the next 100 years maybe, but we will probably not see revolutions in the capitalist centers. Like, would you say that we experience a revolutionary situation? And if yes, where do we see that? Could you
well,
maybe explain that?
Is, as Lenin reminded us over a century ago, the weak links in the imperialist chain. So what that looks like, where that's going to happen, is invariably somewhat by chance, but somewhat also by looking at the contradictions of the world around us. Now, the first thing that we need to say is that capitalism, as we have known it for the past 5 centuries, is over. All right. So that doesn't mean that what is in our future is all rosy and we can hunt in the morning and fish in the afternoon and write poetry at night and do whatever else we want. It means that the historic mechanisms of power, profit, and life that have obtained for the past 5 centuries are now broken, and broken beyond repair. Why? Because the sources of cheap nature, fundamentally the cheap food, cheap labor nexus is irremediably broken. Really proximately by the climate crisis, which is now drawing the curtains on the agricultural revolution model of modernity. So that's a model that goes back to the Dutch and the English and the sugar plantation colonies of the 16th and 17th century that basically did this: produce more and more and more food with less and less and less socially necessary labor time. That mechanism of agricultural revolution is now broken. We can read in a recent number of Nature Climate Change that fully 8 years of productivity have been lost already due to climate change. This is not a Malthusian argument. This is a Marxist argument, because agricultural productivity regulates the price of labor power and the conditions of class struggle on a world scale. And so when these moments of agricultural revolution exhaust themselves, as they did at the end of the 18th century, then revolutionary upsurges tend to occur. But not just that. When the climate changes dramatically, ruling classes enter into severe political problems. This is true within capitalism, and this was true long before capitalism in the crisis of the 14th century, and even earlier, the crisis of the Roman West. So dramatically unfavorable climate changes are bad for ruling classes. They're bad for everyone else over the short run, but they are absolutely disastrous for conditions of political instability. So just to remind all of you, the 2 most dramatic moments of little ice age climate downturns in the history of the modern world were in the 17th century, the era of great political crisis, and also the era where we get modern liberal theory of Descartes and Hobbes and everyone else, and then the age of revolutions in the capitalist Atlantic between 1780 and 1820. So that, which was the last great cold period of the Little Ice Age. These were periods of tremendous political instability, of war and upheaval, and so on and so forth. So we want to look at the question of crisis rather than revolutionary situation, I think, because that conjures up images of storming the White Palace. There's no White Palace to storm. There are banking sectors to socialize and nationalize and wield in the interest of the planetary proletariat, but there's no White Palace to storm. And we need to look seriously at that history of revolutionary upheaval as well, as I mentioned, which anti-communism has sort of brainwashed us into thinking there's nothing there. But in any event, capitalism, as we have known it, is basically a system of accumulating capital by appropriating the unpaid work of, to quote Maria Mies, women, nature, and colonies. It's a system in which socially necessary labor time, the whole zone of the cash nexus, depends on socially necessary unpaid labor. And that's coming to an end. Remember that capitalism is not a steady state. It has to grow or die. Here, I'm not as sanguine as people like David Harvey, that the reproduction of the mass of capital is increasingly difficult, and the signs of a great stagnation are everywhere. And the biggest problems of climate change and a climate class revolt have only just begun. So today we can see 19 trillion with a T, $19 trillion of surplus capital parked in zero or negative rate of return government bonds across the world. We can see that globally capital is becoming increasingly rentier oriented. So the amount of commercially invested money in real estate has gone from 6 trillion to more than 9 trillion in less than 1 decade. So there are serious questions of the great stagnation of capitalism that are inducing a transition. And again, we're seeing this, and unfortunately, we're seeing in their very divergent ways, China and the United States pursuing various, I think, courses of transition, programs of transition to a post-capitalist class society in which politics will be in command. The Chinese with Belt and Road are being much more sophisticated. The US, at the end of the day, has the world's largest armory. It has the world's largest military. And even though surprisingly the US is withdrawing from Afghanistan at long last, the overall thrust of the American project is to ensure that cheap natures of one sort or another can continue to flow to the places they need to go in order to enhance the capital accumulation of the American imperial bourgeoisie. So in the era of climate crisis, we need to recognize that capitalism is essentially done for as we have known it. That doesn't mean there won't be finance. It doesn't mean there won't be proletarians. It doesn't mean there won't be markets. But all of those existed before capitalism, too. Too often we have a textbook version of what capitalism is. And capitalism is a system of endless accumulation that relies on militarized accumulation and a Promethean impulse to appropriate the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies. That has to come from frontiers of cheap nature, and the climate crisis, amongst other dynamics, signals the end of cheap nature, indeed the implosion of the cheap nature model, where previously costs could be put onto the web of life. No longer. The contradictions within the whole web of life are now feeding directly and intimately into the dynamics of accumulation, as the pandemic, by the way, underscores. So those are a few thoughts.
I agree that capitalism, as we know, is coming to an end, which is the title of a book of Elmar Altvater from 2008. And I agree that there are a lot of limits, but I think as the left, we are not so much interested in the end of capitalism, but in the end of class society, of subordination. So our aims are equality, liberty, solidarity. And of course, there are a lot of options of having worse class societies and less solidarity in the future. So a refederalization of social relationships is what many theorists are previewing already for 20 or more years. So I'm not so I wouldn't make the link between capitalist crisis and a future of social revolutions. I lived many years or some years in Colombia, and I think the collapse of capitalism is already there. Yeah, in many countries of the global South, you have systems which never, or societies which that never have been really capitalistic, that integrated into capitalist markets, world markets, but in a way have feudal relationships in the society. So I think there's a lot of possibilities of getting into new forms of terrible forms of subordination. And you have, if you want to get out of this horizon, you need emancipatory movements which demand a change in the direction of solidarity, equality, liberty for all, and not only the possessing ones. So I think there's no, at the moment I don't feel, or I don't see too many reasons for being optimistic, because we have really a big, and now we're coming into the strategic discussion, we have a huge lack because my kids, for example, asked me, they participated in Fridays for Future. Now, this week I was on the summer camp in Schleswig-Holstein from Fridays for Future. And it's, there's a lot of people want to participate and to change, but they ask, what do we have to do to change? Because we can say, if you address to politics and address to governments, this won't change the things. You have to confront capital. Okay. And then my kids ask me, what does this mean? How do we confront? Yeah, we have to fight them back. How do we fight them back? Okay, we have to enforce or to empower common properties and commons, and to Deutsche Wohnen is a good example, how to get back into common property against private property. So we have to amplify these movements. Okay, yeah, but we don't have the time to amplify these movements from Deutsche Wohnen into those large front of social struggles, because we have 5 or 10 years for these changes. So I'm really, if we get into this discussion, what are the possible panoramas? There are a lot of terrible panoramas, yeah, and there has to be a strategic proposal, and not only a theoretical one, but a shared collective one of all these different parts of the left, because that's our problem. We have a lot of interesting and intelligent proposals, but we never agree on anything, because everybody thinks that he is the best and most interesting theorist or politician. And that's our problem. We have no collective understanding, and we only will become political power if we construct collective thinking and collective acting. And that's, I think, our main problem, at the moment.
I think the question of revolution is one that we can kind of put to the side, because not that it's not important to have revolutions, and in the plural they will happen. Like Jason is saying, there will be a lot of situations in which food prices, for instance, rise in a way that will cause uprisings, that will spill into revolutions, as it did in 2011. That was one of the driving factors, among others, of course. But what we're facing is the necessity of transition. And revolutions play a role in transition, but what we're facing is a much broader question, which is epochal, of a transition beyond, at the very least, in the short-term, fossil capitalism. But of course, capitalism itself can continue potentially, and this I think remains an open question and a practical one as well. But capitalism might be able to continue as non-fossil capitalism, and that will still be hugely destructive, and that will slow down destruction, but it will not stop destruction of the planetary life support system upon which we depend and which we shape in so many ways through our participation in capitalism, whether it's fossil driven or not. So the question is one of transition. And I like to go back to Marx and Engels, not because they had all the answers, I don't think they did, but I think they had a really good method that we can learn from, and using the method we can come up with the right questions quite often, which will have other answers because we're in a different situation now, but also because some of their answers back then might even have been false, who knows. That's a kind of academic debate at this point. But in terms of the method, one way they posed the problem of the overcoming of the current state of things was to say, this is not a question of a utopia or a plan, it's a question of the real movement that abolishes, aufhebt, the current state of things. So what is in the word aufhebt? Aufhebung is on the one hand negation or abolition, and on the other hand transition into something else. And why are they connected? They're essentially connected because if you just abolish what is an economic system, what you have is a mode of non-reproduction. It's suffering, right? And capitalism still feeds people, and some not at all, but great masses of people have their daily reproduction through the capitalist destruction of ecosystems and exploitation of labor, etc. But it feeds people. So just negating, abolishing capitalism or fossil capitalism would mean at the very least, if you did that immediately, it would mean rapidly rising energy prices, rapidly rising commodity prices, and mass suffering under the current conditions of class power, because the bill would be passed on to consumers, to workers who would lose their jobs, to welfare recipients through austerity and so on. So there needs to be transition at the same time. Abolition is not enough. And so what's in transition? I mean, there are a lot of proposals for transition that presume that we do the transition first and then the abolition comes all by itself, right? We just invest a lot in green energy and all of a sudden there will be no need to abolish fossil fuels because they'll simply be outcompeted, right? That's a very beautiful, like it's a beautifully naive idea. I mean, by now everyone should, which doesn't mean that everyone does, know about the Jevons paradox, which I myself learned too late. It should be like a basic thing in school, but the Jevons paradox in relation to, so Jevons was a 19th century British economist, not a left-winger, but he was interested in coal and whether if you develop better technologies that were more efficient in coal burning, they would be able to decrease the use of coal or at least stabilize the use of coal. And what he found was, no, efficiency in coal burning simply increases the amount of coal available, lowers the price of coal, so it fuels growth in coal-using industries. And that works out in relation to green energy like this. If the more green energy we put on the market without abolishing fossil fuels, the more energy is available, the cheaper is energy, the more we fuel growth, which means that it doesn't, by any natural mechanism, replace coal or oil or fossil gas, right? So there needs to be abolition. It's simply not enough to talk about transition and imagine that abolition will take care of itself, and abolition will have to happen within the foreseeable future. And so, you know, that's the other side of it that I would like to stress. Abolition needs to happen urgently, and it needs to happen with the urgency with which people fought for the abolition of slavery. That seems very clear, and the slavery was not abolished through the vote. It was abolished through struggle and through the becoming impossible of the slave economy, not just through civil war, but through the self-emancipation of the slaves who were escaping under conditions of civil war, and before that through the removal of slave labor as an energy resource of that regime through the Underground Railroad, people escaping slavery, as well as through militant action like John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So in relation to fossil fuels, what that means, and those last events I mentioned were conditions under which civil war happened, and we have to remember that Lincoln didn't go into the Civil War with the project of abolishing slavery, right? So in order for abolition to come on the agenda, there has to be militant action. There has to be withdrawal of the energy resource from the economy. Sorry, I'm going on very long, but I want to say what that means. It means that we have to consider Andreas Malm's proposal of sabotage. We have to think about strikes. We have to think about other forms of direct action, like what Ende de Gelände doing against the coal mines. I don't think it's at all sufficient. Like I said, if they're successful without something else being put in place, it will be very unpopular and potentially, I don't think they'll be strong enough to make it disastrous, but it'll be unpopular unless there is something else in its place. And we can talk about that.
Yeah, that's actually perfect that you mentioned. That's what I wanted to ask anyways, as if I already told you before, because I already warned you that I wanted to bring in Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, because this is one suggestion that is also being discussed now, as you said, because we have actually real events and groups who are trying to sabotage fossil capitalism in a really concrete way, and this is one strategic approach. And then what Andreas, that's what he suggests in this book, and in another book he also suggests a counter, like, hegemonic project, in a sense that you have to also mobilize the majority of people for a different kind of society. So I think he what I guess he proposes. I'm just using his side to provoke you to tell more about your strategy and your approach, because how I understand him, it's like a dual strategy. The one is more radical, and the other one is like has more of the social democratic, eco-socialist kind of wing that Jason mentioned before. And I want to ask you, like, be a little bit more concrete when it comes to actors and who does what, and how do they work together. I mean, I get what you mean by saying collective action. I would agree to that. But what does it mean? Who is doing what? And yeah, so please elaborate on that. Maybe Raul and Ru, I don't know. And then Jason can, like, I'm really interested in knowing what Jason thinks about this. I really have no idea.
I thought Jason would be first. So I'm
not always.
So I'm not really prepared to say anything.
You had a book. You have a book about an alternative vision.
No, I don't have. I think at first I wanted to say I think the problem is not just about transition from fossil capitalism. It's about a transition from valorization of everything. So because this is really great when I talk with Birgit Mahrenkopf or when I read her studies, because she insists so much in for example, that the so-called green economic digitalization is one of the worst developments that we could observe. So I think I know that you said this before too, but anyhow, I want to insist in it. If we get out of fossil capitalism and we get into digital capitalism, we will have a lot of new ecological problems that can be the same or worse. Yeah. So what we have to stop is the process of valorization, and that I think is why we should insist so much that the ecological struggle is a struggle against the core of capitalism, of the capitalist need and aim of valorization of everything. So, and we have to stop it in all areas possible. This is the reason why I mentioned Deutsche Wohnen and Eignen. Of course, it's not an ecological movement, but it's a way of stopping the process of valorization. And well, this is why I think that it's about collective action. I totally agree what you said about we should not discuss so much about, well, you didn't say this, that we shouldn't discuss about theory, but you said that we should insist in concrete movements, and I totally agree with this. Socialism or the concept of communism for me is the real movements that come up from the real contradictions of society of today. So we have to to look what social struggles come up, and this is totally previsible. You say this, yeah. For example, mentioning another one's Colombia. For me, it was totally unthinkable that we had now a post-COVID insurrection in Colombia, about 3 months of social insurrection. And the most astonishing or surprising thing was that it took place in neighborhoods that were totally controlled by drug dealers or by mafia groups. So we had in Colombia some regions of urban areas which were under influence or control of leftist guerrillas until the early 80s or mid 80s, and then passed totally to the cartels. And now we have neighborhoods where we have organization of young people, and it is interesting because they practice solidarity, and they build up this common kitchens where everybody eats together. And we thought that this was these were lost neighborhoods. So I think it's not so interesting to think now what could come up in the future, but there will come social struggles, collective struggles about very different issues, and we have to be able to get into these struggles and propose common practices with an horizon of an emancipatory horizon, and especially with practices of solidarity. So I'm not really sure if I gave an answer to what you asked, but I would say we have to connect this ecological and social horizon, and we have to look for collective struggles with emancipatory possibilities. This would be my
So after socializing housing, we're going to socialize the banking sector, just like Jason suggested. That's a good project.
Look at how the bourgeoisie responded to even the relatively tepid measures of left-wing social democracy in the 1970s. Look at the response that was meted out to it, and the utter capitulation of social democratic parties to those counter-revolutionary forces.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, capital is not going to stand still for the socialization of banking.
Probably not.
No, I mean they're going to be rounding people up and putting them in prisons and sending the army into cities to ensure order.
Yeah. And I was just joking because we have this vote on actually socializing housing in Berlin, and so everyone is talking about how difficult this is already. So it's not easy to organize a majority for.
Because it has to do with the zero-sum situation of capitalism's great stagnation in the moment. Because one can, of course, go back to Red Vienna or go back to the Swedish Social Democrats' great housing programs and look at what was possible in an era of expansion, of economic expansion, underwritten by cheap nature. Those conditions no longer hold. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
But you still have to answer my questions on political strategy. Boo, please elaborate on what exactly you mean. Who does
so that's a question.
The action.
Okay, so what the strategy presupposes? It presupposes that you have some kind of collective agency, right? So I'm not here as a participant in any movement. Sadly, I have to say. But if I were, I would talk about the strategy of that movement. And we can have discussions within our movements and parties and trade unions or whatever of our strategy. But we cannot have a grand strategy because we don't have a grand subject. And I don't think it's quite possible to forge a grand subject except in a very precarious way in a very great revolutionary crisis, which will be in a specific location and situation. And obviously we'll have limitations and contradictions and so on. So I would say, like, I can't talk about strategy, but about the conditions of strategy, right? So we're all capable to very different degrees of strategizing in our individual everyday lives. If you have inherited 200,000 euros, you can strategize long term about where you're going to invest that money. Okay, am I going to buy a flat for myself or whatever? So you have a long time horizon because you have property, right? If you're very precarious, you can still strategize about your next job, but it's very hard. And if you're extremely precarious, it's just like everyday tactics of survival, right? So, and what it means is if you form small groups of mutual aid, you can start to develop tactics and strategies that include a larger group of people. So producing the conditions of collective strategy means to create greater collective subjects than individuals and increase the strategic capacity. And that can be done in many different ways. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the early labor movement, socialist movement, communist movement, which was to say they didn't just say we offer another society or we offer a different political program. They also said very essentially, here's how you can get back at the boss who's an asshole. This is how you can organize, or we can organize, against the pollution in our neighborhood by this plant that's down the road. This is how we can feed ourselves when we're unemployed because we're going to do a solidarity kitchen. This is, this is how a lot of basic welfare programs were developed as forms of what the Black Panthers called survival programs pending revolution. And this is essentially like trade unionism is a mutual aid strategy. to begin, like at its root, it's workers who engage in mutual aid in order to improve their conditions, right? And this is what has been greatly undermined by the kind of individualization of neoliberalism. So one way to talk about this that goes beyond or kind of tries to think the question of natural ecologies and social ecologies together is, how do we weave relations of reproduction that are autonomous, that create a collective capacity to act? How do we reweave social fabrics and social fabrics within nature? That's the question, and in some cases it's more obvious to others than others what it has to do with other species. But like in some cases, community gardens are bases of popular discussions, assemblies, and fiestas, and of struggle, bases of struggle, and cooperative movements work the same way. So to give you one example, and this is going to be the last thing I say, is the Danish social democratic movement in the early 20th century had three legs. It was a political party that tried to weave together the strategies of the different trade unions. Then there were the trade unions, the second leg, and the third leg was the cooperative movement, the workers' cooperative. And one thing that's really interesting about this is not just that it was about providing quality food, for instance, or housing at affordable prices to workers, but also it was about creating the conditions under which you could more easily strike. So what they called the food cooperatives, they called them material strike funds. So it's not just that you have the money in the bank that you can use to pay yourself when you're in strike. You can also distribute the food that you have in your workers' supermarket. So I think this kind of approach is essential, and I think that creates a different common sense among ordinary people, which creates a totally different resonance if someone comes with proposals, like from a political party that's struggling for hegemony in the political arena, to where it's not just, oh, that sounds nice, but it has nothing to do with my everyday experiences. It's an abstract idea. Solidarity, what is that? No, this is what I experience in the everyday life, so why not scale it up? So I think everyday experience is essential to the appeal of political proposals also.
Yeah, thank you. So, Jason, what is your political strategy approach? Like, I would really like to ask, like, how do you organize the femitariat? Like, would you suggest women's strikes, or like, what is the consequence of what you say is who is oppressed most, or like what do we neglect usually in leftist terms? Like, how would you strategize that?
Yes, to your point. I mean, of course, the condition of the femitariat is the condition of the proletariat. There are distinctions within a unity, diversity within a unity. One of the things about here, just pardon me while I make this point about dialectics, that a dialectical point of view contains both the argument for the tendency and the counter tendency. This is what always amazes me when people encounter the Kapitalozän argument. They say, well, what about the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union was just as bad towards nature. Well, first of all, it was not just as bad towards nature. And second of all, the Soviet project was an imminent contradiction of capitalism itself. And so it's important to go back and look at the history of socialist projects, not least in terms of social reproduction. Just ask yourself, where would you rather be a woman in 1935 in Nazi Germany or in Soviet Russia? And there's no doubt as to the answer. So the relation, I mean, I'm less prone to the kind of clickbait Marxist sloganeering that we see in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, when somebody like Malm has no intention whatsoever of going and blowing up actually existing pipelines. So a slogan that you really have to unpack like that and explain isn't much of a slogan. It's like defund the police in the United States. A slogan you have to explain is not all that useful. But that said, I mean, Malm and I, despite his protestations of calling me a class enemy, agree on fundamental issues of working class agency and the need to organize the working class. It's just that Malm is not a very strong anti-imperialist, and you can see this from his fundamental text, Fossil Capital. There's no reason to call that era fossil capital any more than to call it slave cotton capital. Indeed, the fossil fuel revolution in England only occurs on the heels of a prior proletarianization, not only within England, but also the plantation proletariat, which is totally ignored. And it is only the decline in the price of cotton, as Marx reminds us, and it's backed by serious economic history, that allows for the rise of industrial capitalism. So that's crucial if we want to think through the question of revolutionary agency and the plantation proletariat. In that example, the proletariat is not only the English working class in the mill towns, it is also the plantation proletariat, the proletariat identified by communist, African-American communist historians like C.L.R. James, like W.E.B. Du Bois. It was great to hear Boy mention the conditions of abolition. Of course, the conditions of abolition are not only the protracted class struggles by the plantation proletarians, but also by the availability of new streams of cheap nature precisely at the moment of the rolling abolition from the 1830s all the way until the 1880s. So it's and you weren't making this comparison, but many do. They say, well, we can decarbonize just like slavery was abolished. No, that's not true. The abolition of slavery did not take place in a great stagnation and at a moment of the colossal overaccumulation of capital. It occurred in very, very different conditions where most of the world, especially Africa, especially South Asia, and then China towards the end of the century, were opened up for capital investment and imperialist extraction. So I'm mentioning these issues because I think that they're actually central to the question of revolutionary strategy. And bringing up Malm at the beginning is great because he has this whole riff. Well, I'm an ecological Leninist, because apparently being an ecological Marxist isn't dope enough or woke enough or whatever it is. But look at the Lenin that he appropriates. It's a Lenin that has nothing to do with Lenin at Baku. When Lenin realizes that the socialist revolution in the West is not going to happen famously after the defeats in Germany, but also Hungary and elsewhere. He realizes, and I'm not imputing any particular wisdom to Lenin, he simply could see where the action was headed. He goes to the great National Liberation Anti-Imperialist Conference in Baku and understands that the Archimedean lever of the worldwide class struggle in the 20th century is in national liberation movements. This is the fundamental position of people like Samir Amin, of Emmanuel Wallerstein, Frantz Fanon, many, many others in identifying the problems of Eurocentric class analysis, that we must have class analysis, but it must be an anti-imperialist class analysis. And to that, what I have tried to contribute is a wider set of struggles over, to your question, between paid and unpaid work. So the question of mobilizing proletarian feminism is very close to that of working class environmentalism, both of which have been subordinated by their bourgeois counterparts, bourgeois feminism, bourgeois environmentalism. In the United States, for instance, movements towards working class environmentalism, perhaps typified best by Lois Gibbs at Love Canal, the famous episode of toxic waste dumping and cancer clusters identified by Lois Gibbs and other working class women in upstate New York in the late 1970s, which gave rise to an anti-toxics movement, which was always opposed by environmentalism in the United States. And we can repeat that story many, many times over. Working class environmentalism was never environmentalism. So when we ask about the conditions of struggle, we need to, for one thing, insist that mainstream green politics go through its truth and reconciliation moment for the crimes against the working class, for its anti-immigration politics, for its nationalism and its soft position on imperialism. I'm not saying this rhetorically, I mean concretely. You can look at many episodes in the rich countries of the world with big green groups. In the United States, environmentalists refused to do anything around the war in Vietnam, and they supported NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and broke the back of labor and popular opposition to free trade, which then opened the floodgates to the neoliberal ecological hellscapes that followed. So we need to look at mainstream environmentalism as part of the problem and to reconstruct a proletarian, a working class environmentalist movement that takes the problems of imperialism and the worldwide dynamics of class struggle, if you will, at its heart. So in that sense, I'm not sure that Andreas, if he were here, would disagree with that statement. But I think we also have to look at how people are reconstructing the history, because history is prologue to revolutionary strategy.
Okay. I just saw that we have enough time for some questions from the audience, maybe if you want to. I mean, I have one big question left, but I have talked enough. So please, if you have a question, feel free to ask anything. You don't have...
Auch auf Deutsch?
Sure.
Das geht, no?
Yeah, sure. We can try to translate. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, please. No, I was looking for someone. Yeah. Good.
Hello, thank you for this really thrilling discussion. It's like in a Netflix series. I love it. Very, very spannend, as we say. And thank you so much also for pointing out again and again, Jason, but also Bue, the feminist, that feminism is in the core of the environmentalist project that we need. And it is also interesting because this was also not written in history, not in the history of the environmentalists, and also not in the history of the feminists, by the way. And these currents have been marginalized, and we have to actualize them again. And because we cannot understand man and nature if we don't understand women and nature, and if we don't women and men, and if we also don't understand enslaved and men. So coming from a feminist perspective, I will pose a question that maybe is connected to what you called mutual aid strategies, because I think, I don't know, for me, as also having been a leftist activist, I think that the left for too long had a very progressivist horizon about, our perspective was to have more rights, more wealth, more people. I mean, it was a very progressivist, industrialist, fossil horizon of liberation, and I think we are still not there to be able to think, what is this horizon actually? And with talking with the means of social reproduction in feminist strategies, of course, you talk about reproduction and regeneration. And having in mind the theme of this conference here about kollapsology, and having heard Jonathan Franzen, who said in a very bourgeois way, one has to say, but on Monday said about that there is no, of course, we are having the collapse very soon, right? So what you would do, and we have to prepare for the collapse and not to prepare for another progressivist horizon where things get better, which means in a feminist repair practice that we have to start to prepare for how do we manage the collapse, you know? What does this mean, the mutual aid, in a historical situation that there is not more to actually, that there's scarcity, yes? That there's scarcity of everything. So my question is, what about the terms repair? What do you think about it as progressive leftists? The terms regeneration, what do we think about it? And maybe tomorrow also on this panel we will talk about adaptation. And there's also a whole new discussion about adaptation because we're in another historical situation than 20 years ago. So maybe you can say something about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want to start, Bue?
Sure. Thank you for that wonderful question. I think it's really essential, this point about progressivism and the progressivist horizon being, on the one hand, exhausted, on the other hand, continuing in a kind of zombie-like or nostalgic manner, and thereby being capable of causing harm also in two ways, which is one, fueling the continuation of the kind of progressivist project in industrialist terms that we need to break out of, which doesn't mean that we have to break with all and any kind of industry, but we have to have a very different conception of what industry might mean. And also in the sense of what Lauren Belland called cruel optimism. So for her, cruel optimism is being optimistic about something. Where your optimism that something might happen undermines your conditions for making it happen. So if you believe that progress is possible and you're optimistic about the future, it might keep you from doing the things that and engaging in the struggles that can make something good happen. To put it in very simplistic terms. So, okay, but I also think, as much as we have to reject this kind of teleological understanding of history as continual cumulative improvement, we also have to reject the obverse image, which is the collapsologist version, which has been a feature of not just modern history, but also religious imaginary in the past, that everything is going to hell, everything is going to shit. No, what we'll have in the kind of tongue-in-cheek terms of Evan Calder Williams is we'll have combined and uneven apocalypse, right? Or combined and uneven disaster, because before apocalypse, which is using in a semi-joking way, of course, we'll have many different kinds of disaster that will hit very unevenly, and there will be very different zones of relative comfort or suffering. But all those ways of being affected, not just like the people in Western Germany have been affected by the floods, but the way that we're all affected materially, but in the shape of our brain chemistry when we worry about the future, we're materially affected. I think that's actually, even if we're not hit by a flood, we're materially affected. That means that disaster is already playing out, even before, in a sense, it struck us. And I think this question of how do you struggle from the position of being affected, I think is really crucial. So one movement that we can draw inspiration from in relation to this is the platform of people affected by mortgages in Spain. You know it very well, I'm sure. So as you know, there was a big housing crisis in Spain. Hundreds of thousands of people were evicted from their homes. And the activists who started a movement that managed to stop a very large amount of evictions didn't say the banks are corrupt, we've been cheated, because they knew that the people who were about to be evicted or fearing that they might be evicted didn't have the subjectivity of activists. They were just worried about the future, right? So they organized meetings where people could share their worries and get advice, give each other advice of what they've learned, and in that way realize that they were not alone. And this, other people are in the same situation. I'm not a loser and a failure for being unable to live the normative dream of my society, but there is something going on that's much bigger, and we can actually struggle together to deal with that problem. And so I think that there is a kind of almost like we need some kind of self-help as a prelude to the construction of political agency and political subjectivity. I think when it comes to being affected in this in this way. So this is not to take away like all the things that I think Ines would love to discuss, and I think Jacobin does well, is the question, what is the role of trade unions, what is the role of the left party? I think that's really interesting and important, and maybe Raul has something to say to this, but so, or other have more precise questions regarding that. Yeah, sorry for going on so long.
Do you want to reply to?
Yeah, I agree totally what you said, Margarita, and what Boe said. I would also, I also think that a new revolutionary concept should have in its core, in its center, the idea of care values and care practices. So I would agree on the feminist reformulation of communist strategies. And I would like to add another thing. I also agree totally on the need of mutual aid and solidarity practices. I think, and there are a lot of examples for this. For example, now in the COVID crisis, the amnesty movement, the landless peasants in Brazil, they have cooperatives because they have occupied plantations in the last decades. And now in the COVID crisis, they send food into the poor neighborhoods of some cities. So I think this was symbolic, but anyhow, I think this is how we can construct networks of mutual aid and reformulate the idea. And I wanted to add one thing, because I also agree what Jason said about the need of understanding the class relationship as global relationships and as a global proletariat. If we want, I wouldn't use the term so much, but I agree what he wants to say. And for me, it was always the reason why I was active in internationalist movements. And for me, the Colombian peasant, of course, is part of the global working class and a very important one. And the indigenous people too, which reject the valorization of their land. I think this is a very important proletarian practice, even if they are not proletarians in the traditional sense. And I wanted to say this was one of the reasons why we in the Left Party rejected so energically the discourses of Sarah Wagenknecht. I remember it because Ines, as a journalist, sometimes said, why do you have so many discussions in the left about different positions? It was because, from my point of view, she touched the core or the main parts of what a leftist project is. I think a leftist project has sense only if it's based as a solidarity, as a common ground. I think we can differ in many other issues, but we cannot differ in the issue of solidarity. I think this is the core of our project, equality and solidarity. And I'm sure that the nationalist discourse that she used was intended to break up this common ground of the left. And this is the reason why we said we cannot make one step together with this position, and we have to break up with her if it's necessary. And this is what many other people from outside didn't understand, and this is the reason why I wanted to mention it another once, because I agree with what Jason said. We have to understand it as a global project and a global fight.
Can I add to this? I think this is a really essential point. And I think you will agree with what I say. I just want to expand on it, which is that what someone like Sarah Wagenknecht was proposing was not just against the left project in ethical terms or in terms of our values or utopian horizon, but also against the left project in a strategic sense, because and in a material sense, because creating divisions between proletarians, essentially, on the basis of citizenship or on the basis of ethnicity or on the basis of whatever else it might be, undermines the conditions of solidarity, which is the only base of our common power. So it undermines our collective capacity to act and achieve political change. And it also undermines our project of making the change happen. So, I come originally from Denmark. I live in Austria now. Countries like Austria and Germany, Austria and Denmark and Germany as well, it's perfectly possible to create this kind of mirage of a green society where everything is working very, very well, but all the kinds of technologies and things that we consume ethically and blah, blah, blah are based on exploitation of people outside of Europe, as well as the very harmful extraction of raw materials, etc. But we live in a world where everything seems to be fine on the surface, and which means that's another way that creating an imaginary community that stops at the border undermines the left project of creating a world that is not premised on exploitation, but also like isn't running towards collapse, essentially.
And this, just to reinforce your point, is the, I don't know if tragedy is the right term, but the history of mainstream environmentalism, which has on the one hand embraced a rhetoric of the whole earth, and at the same time pursued nationalism from the very beginning, which has been anti-immigrant, anti-working class also from the very beginning. You can look across the rich countries, but especially in the Anglosphere, in Britain, the United States, Canada, you see precisely the problem you've just designated, which from the beginning, from the early 1970s, was accommodating not only to the Vietnam War, but also led very directly to a refusal to challenge a resurgent American imperialism in the 1980s and 90s, coupled with free trade liberalism. So this, when we ask, we've come to the point where we need to ask, after a half century following the first Earth Day, we have to stop asking, has modern environmentalism failed? Maybe it was pursuing precisely the goal it wanted to pursue all along, which was to stabilize business as usual and form these very national-centered networks of what I like to call the environmental industrial complex, of big green groups, of ministries, of academics, et cetera, because in all of this, and to take it back to the question of feminism, I think we really need to recognize that the revolutionary politics of climate change is feminist, or it's nothing. It's anti-imperialist, or it's nothing. And it's working class centered in the sense of the planetary proletariat. And I use that language, Raul, not the global proletariat, because of a specific constitutive tissue about how capitalism works. It puts wage workers to work through the cash nexus, but the normal form of the proletarian condition is always the semi-proletarian. And we see this with the so-called peasants of places like Brazil, most of whom are semi-proletarians, strictly speaking. And we see the dynamics of feminized unpaid work and of putting the web of life to work for profit-making opportunities. So there are alienated work relations in all these spheres of paid work, of unpaid work, of humans and the rest of nature. And can I also just bring up, and there's no way that we can have a proper discussion around this, I want to affirm 1,000 times yes about mutual aid, about supporting all sorts of repair, reconstruction, reinvention, finding new communal and commons arrangements to survive to the next step. Boy mentioned the Black Panthers. And yes, indeed, survival programs were an interesting element of that politics. What's happened over the past 40 years is a kind of fetishization, however, of this kind of thinking of small is beautiful horizontalism. And I'm not criticizing horizontalism as such. I'm criticizing the tendency to fetishize it because, yes, small may be beautiful, but in the era of climate crisis, big is necessary.
And the Panthers were Leninists.
Pardon, say it again?
The Panthers were Maoists and following a Leninist strategy. Wait, by the way, I wouldn't describe myself as
is that a compliment or a critique?
No, well, I don't even know. I just want to say that there is, I just want to stress what you know. So to the audience, if anyone doesn't, which everyone might, that there are mutual aid strategies that are part of political programs for building class composition within a broader strategy of transformation, and there are forms of small is beautiful, which is, I agree that fetishization has been strong. I think in the United States probably more than in Europe, is my sense. But that's an irrelevant debate.
No, that's true.
I suppose.
Well, I think it was a good last sentence you had, Jason. It has to be big, which confronts the small kind of communities and changes. And no, it's not small. But like, where does it start? You know, like in communities and like mutual aid, or like I wanted to ask about the state level, but this would like completely explode.
Can we remind people too, when I say small is beautiful, that's a title of a book by E.F. Schumacher from 1972, I believe, called Small is Beautiful. And the problem is that you end up with the environmentalist mantras like live simply so that others may live. Think globally, but act locally. Those are slogans of organizing that are completely consonant with neoliberal rule. And so in an era of climate crisis, where, as I like to point out, if we look at the coastline of the United States, every major city is going to have to be rebuilt and probably moved. That means new sewer systems, new electrical grids, and new everything. How is that going to be done? Is it going to be done from the standpoint of the working class, or is it going to be done from the standpoint of the bourgeoisie?
Okay, well, that calls for revolution, I would say. But anyway, I think we have touched upon like many of the very difficult questions on revolutionary strategy, and I think we're all really tired by now. I don't see any more questions from the audience. So I thank you all on the panel, Raul, Bue, and Jason, and you for the question. And thank you for this discussion. And as I promised earlier, no, I didn't say that, like we have Raul's book on the book table outside, so you can get this, and you can also get Jason's book outside on the book table, so feel free to look into them. And I hope you have a great evening. Thank you to Brecht-Haus and Literaturforum in Brecht-Haus for the whole week, for Guillaume for organizing the whole week on Kollapsologie. I think it was really intense, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thanks for facilitating.
Thank you.